there is a version of love that nobody teaches you to name. It lives in the wait of a Sunday afternoon, in the particular silence between the laundry and the grocery list, between the life you are still folding and the life that is about to come undone. We spend so much time learning how to love. We spend almost no time learning how to survive the discovery that the love we thought we knew was, in some essential way, a different thing entirely, not lesser, not false, but a different shape than the one we had been holding. Think about what it means to know someone. Not the facts of them, their birthday, the way they take their coffee, the sound they make when they are almost asleep. But to know someone is to carry a story about them inside your own body. A story that says, this is who this person is. This is what this love means. And here's the thing. Nobody tells you that story can be entirely, tenderly, heartbreakingly incomplete. And the person who lived inside it may have loved you with everything they had while still being trapped in a silence you could not hear. Tonight's story begins on a Sunday afternoon in Chicago in a house where a woman named Diane Park was folding laundry. It begins, as so many of the stories that change us begin, in the most ordinary moment imaginable. A basket of clothes, a list on the kitchen counter, a phone that had not yet rung. She'd been married for 31 years. She had raised 2 daughters in that house. She had built a life so solid she had never thought to question its foundation. And then the phone rang, and then a young man said something into that phone that no amount of folded laundry could have prepared her for. And then the kitchen was very quiet, and then the sun went down, and she sat there. What do you do when the story you have carried about someone you love turns out to have been missing a chapter, not because they deceived you out of cruelty, but because they were drowning in a silence that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with a world that had never given them permission to breathe? What do you do with a love that was real and has always been real and still could not contain the whole truth of who your child is? That is the question this episode will sit with. Not answer, sit with, because the women and men who come to this program are not here for answers. They are here because sitting with the question out loud with someone who is genuinely listening is sometimes the only honest thing left to do. She found it on a Sunday afternoon between the laundry and the grocery list, and by sunrise the next morning, she had not moved from the kitchen, and what she had found was not a thing at all. It was a voice on the phone. It was a son-in-law in pieces. It was a daughter she had known for 30 years and somehow had not known at all. Not because Diane had failed and not because Soo-Jin had failed, but because some truths arrive so late and so quietly that by the time they do, the people who love each other most can barely find the words. Tonight, Diane Park, Chicago, Illinois. Mother of 2, wife of 31 years, and the woman who sat in a kitchen until the sky turned pale, trying to figure out whether to call her daughter or wait. What does it mean to love someone you thought you knew completely and then discover that what you thought you knew was only the part of them they had been brave enough to show you? Does the discovery unmake the love? Or does it ask something harder of it? Stay with us, because Diane has stayed with it. And what she has to say tonight will not let you leave unchanged. Good evening, and welcome back to The Straight Spouse. I'm Harvey, and if you're joining us for the first time, let me tell you what this program is, and more importantly, what it is not. This is not a show about blame. This is not a court. Nobody comes here to win. The Straight Spouse is a storytelling program, a space where people who have lived through the particular experience of loving someone who is LGBT, loving them as a spouse, a partner, a parent, a child, come and tell us what that actually looks like from the inside. Not the headline, not the think piece, the inside, the Sunday afternoon, the kitchen at 3 in the morning, the moment you didn't know what to say, so you didn't say anything at all. I want to be transparent with you from the start, because I think transparency matters here more than anywhere. The stories you hear on this program are based on real experiences, real people, real relationships, real emotions. We do use some production support, including AI-assisted elements in visualization and editing, and we protect identifying details when the people involved have asked us to. but the story, the core of it, the emotional truth of it is real. The person sitting in that kitchen was real. The phone call was real. The sunrise was real. I also want to say this clearly, because this program is a space for everyone who has lived a version of this story, from any side. We are not here to judge the LGBT person in any story we tell. We are not here to suggest that being gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans is a problem that requires a solution. We are not here to counsel anyone back into a closet or forward into an identity. What we are here for, the only thing we are here for, is to make space for the people whose lives were also changed by someone else's truth coming to light, and to ask what that is like, and to listen without flinching. That means the straight spouse gets to speak, and it also means the human being who lived inside the closet gets to be seen as a full person in the telling. Both things are true. This program holds both. Now, if what you just heard resonates with you, if you have lived any version of this story on any side of it, if you have a family member or a friend who has, I want to ask you gently, the way I'd ask a friend to subscribe to this channel if you haven't, and to share this episode with one person who you think might need it. Not to push a narrative at them, just to say, here is someone talking about it. Maybe it helps. That's all it ever has to be. Tonight's guest is Diane Park. Diane is 58 years old. She lives in Chicago, Illinois. For the past 3 decades, she has been what she would call her words, the person who made the house run. She is the mother of 2 daughters. She is, as of 18 months ago, the mother of a daughter who has come out as a lesbian. And she is the woman who found out about it, not from her daughter, but from her daughter's husband during a phone call about divorce. She is a painter herself, actually not professionally, but genuinely. She has a small studio in the back of her house, and she tells me she hasn't been in it much this past year and a half. I think that detail tells you something. I think when we hear the rest of the story, we'll understand why. Diane, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I wasn't sure I'd be able to do this, but I think I need to.
I'm glad you're here. I want to start somewhere that might seem simple, but I find it's often where everything important lives. I want to start before the phone call, before the divorce, before any of the things that brought you here tonight. Tell me what life looked like in that house in Chicago. Just a regular Tuesday.
A regular Tuesday?
A regular Tuesday.
Well, Henry would be up by 6. He's an early riser, always has been. Even in retirement, he's up before the light. He'd be downstairs making coffee. He has this whole ritual with the coffee, the French press, the timer. He's very particular about it, and I'd hear that from upstairs. And that was just the sound of my life. I knew where I was when I heard it. I'd come down, we'd sit at the kitchen table, and we'd have maybe 20 minutes before anything started, and we'd just be quiet together. Henry and I are good at quiet. We always have been.
That's a beautiful detail, 20 minutes of quiet together.
It sounds small, but over 31 years, that adds up to something. That adds up to a whole language.
Tell me about the daughters. What was the texture of that house with 2 girls growing up in it?
Loud. Very loud. Ellen, she's the younger one. She's 25 now. She's in grad school up at Northwestern. Ellen was always the one who filled the room. She'd come downstairs like a weather event. But Soo-Jin was different. She was quieter, more contained. She had this interior life that you could see but couldn't always access. Even when she was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, she'd go off by herself and just be somewhere. Drawing, usually. Always drawing. I'd find her in corners with a sketchbook, or at the kitchen table with markers laid out in a very specific order. She'd get upset if you disturbed. She had a system for everything.
That's Soo-Jin, your older daughter, the one who's 30 now.
Yes, she's a graphic designer. She's brilliant at it. But the painting was always the real thing, even if design paid the bills. She has a real gift. She showed at 2 galleries in Wicker Park before all of this. I used to go to every show. I'd stand in front of her paintings and think, I don't know where this came from. I don't mean that as a mystery. I mean it as wonder.
I want to come back to the painting. But right now, I want to stay with that house. What was the relationship like between you and Soo-Jin when she was growing up? You said she had an interior life you could see, but couldn't always access. What did that feel like as her mother?
It felt like trying to read a book through a window. You could see the pages turning, but you couldn't make out all the words. I don't think she meant to be closed off. I think that was just her nature. She was tender, very tender. She cried at things. Nobody expected her to cry at a commercial on television once. I remember about a dog. She cried for 20 minutes. But ask her what she was feeling about her own life, and she'd go quiet and change the subject so smoothly, you'd almost miss that she had done it.
Was that a source of worry for you, or did it feel like just her?
Both, I think. You know how it is with your children. There are things about them that are just them, and you accept those things as features of the person, not problems to solve. Her quietness felt like her. The way she held things close felt like her. I worried sometimes that she was lonely inside, all that quiet. I used to wonder if there was something I should be saying or asking, but she would always seem okay. She seemed settled, even as a teenager, which is unusual, right? Most teenagers are flying apart at the seams, and Soo-Jin just seemed present, composed.
Looking back now, does that composure read differently to you?
Everything reads differently now. That's the thing about looking back. You have a different flashlight.
I want to ask you about a specific time, a specific version of your family that I think you were still living inside as recently as a few years ago. Soo-Jin met Kevin in her mid-20s, yes? Tell me about that period. Who was your family in that season?
She met Kevin when she was 25. He was 27. She brought him home at Thanksgiving that first year, and I remember thinking, this is a serious one. Not because she said so, but because of the way she was careful with him. Soo-Jin was always careful with things. She valued her sketchbooks, her brushes, certain books she'd been reading and rereading since college. She was that way with Kevin. Careful, deliberate.
What was Kevin like?
Kind, very even-tempered. He was in finance. He is in finance. He's an analyst for a firm downtown, very methodical, the kind of person who brings a spreadsheet to a potluck. Henry liked him immediately, which told me something, because Henry doesn't like people easily. They had the same way of sitting with a problem quiet, turning it over, not rushing to a conclusion. I used to watch them at the dinner table sometimes and think, they're very similar, those two, which I thought was a good thing. I still think it might be, just not in the ways I imagined.
They got engaged after how long?
3 years. She was 28. They had a small ceremony. Soo-Jin didn't want anything big, which again, that was her. She's never been someone who wanted to be the center of a room. They got married in October here in Chicago, about 60 people, a venue in Pilsen, very beautiful. Her paintings were everywhere. She'd done these large pieces, abstract, lots of deep blue and that kind of burnt orange she always used. And they were hung all around the room. I remember standing there the morning of the wedding, helping her get ready and looking out at those paintings around the room and thinking, this is your life in here. All of it. Every color you've ever felt.
That's a stunning image, your daughter's paintings at her own wedding.
It was stunning. It was one of the most beautiful days of my life. I'm not saying that to be nostalgic or to make it hurt more in the telling. I'm saying it because it was true, and it still is true, even knowing everything I know now. That day was real. Those feelings were real. The fact that other things were also true doesn't undo what that morning was.
I want to stay there a moment. In that morning, you're helping her get ready. You're looking at her paintings. What do you remember feeling standing there?
Proud. I was so proud. Not the performative kind, not the kind you say because you're supposed to. The kind that sits low in your chest and just stays there. I looked at her in that dress. She'd chosen something very simple, ivory, no ornamentation, very Soo-Jin, and I thought, she figured out who she is. That was the thought. Not what a beautiful bride, not look how far she's come. Just, she figured out who she is. I thought I was watching someone who had arrived.
Tell me about Kevin and Soo-Jin's life together in those early years. The first year, the second year. What did they look like as a couple?
They were steady. That's the word I'd use. They bought a condo in Logan Square. Kevin was building his career. Soo-Jin was doing freelance design work and painting on the side. She had her first gallery show in Wicker Park about a year after the wedding, a joint show with another artist, and she sold 3 pieces. I remember Kevin at that opening standing near the door, watching people look at her work with this very quiet expression. Not the proud husband putting his arm around the wife for the photos, just watching, attentive, steady.
Did you socialize with them often?
We had dinner together most Sundays. Henry and I, Soo-Jin and Kevin, Ellen when she was in town. It was a ritual, those Sunday dinners. I'd make whatever Soo-Jin had been craving that week. She'd text me on Thursday sometimes. Mum, any chance you could do that doenjang jjigae you made last time? And I'd go to the Korean grocery on Friday. It was easy that time. Easy in the way that only feels like ease when you look back at it and realize you weren't thinking about it at all. You were just living.
There's something you said that I want to come back to. You said at the wedding, looking at her, you thought she figured out who she is. I find myself sitting with that phrase because you're telling me now that in some important way, that story was still incomplete. Did you ever have a moment, even a small one, even one you dismissed, where some piece of that picture seemed like it didn't quite fit?
There was one evening, and I didn't know what to do with it at the time, so I filed it away and kept going. It was about 8 months after the wedding. We were at dinner, the 5 of us, and Ellen had brought a friend, a woman named Margot, who she'd met at school. Very bright, very funny, and the kind of person who makes everyone in a room feel like the most interesting person there. And I noticed, I'm not even sure why I noticed, maybe because I was watching Soo-Jin the way mothers watch their children at a table without even deciding to. I noticed that Soo-Jin became different when Margot was in the room. Not, obviously. Not in any way Kevin would have registered, or Henry, or probably even Ellen. Just brighter, a little more present. Like someone had turned a dial a degree or two in one direction.
What did you make of that at the time?
Nothing. I made nothing of it. I think I told myself she and Margot had a natural chemistry. That kind of instant connection you sometimes have with a stranger who turns out to be your kind of person. I told myself that and I moved on. And I genuinely moved on. I didn't go home and turn it over in my mind. I just filed it away somewhere below where I could see it. And it sat there. It sat there for 3.5 more years.
That detail, that brightness, I suspect we're going to come back to it before we're done tonight.
I think everything comes back to something in the end. That's what I've been learning this past 1.5 years. Everything connects to something else. You just have to be willing to hold the thread.
I want to ask you about the years between that dinner and the phone call. The years when you were still inside the picture of the family you thought you had. Were there things you observed or felt that in retrospect you'd call signs? Not that you recognized them then, but that you can name now?
There were silences that didn't used to be there. That's the first thing. Kevin and Soo-Jin had always been not vocal. They weren't a demonstrative couple. They weren't the couple that finishes each other's sentences and laughs loudly at each other's jokes. But there was a current between them. You could feel it at the table, a kind of calibration. And somewhere around the 3rd year of the marriage, that current changed.
Changed how?
It became careful. That's the word. They'd always been careful with each other, but this was a different kind of careful. This was the careful of people who were choosing every word before they say it. I noticed Kevin had started doing this thing where he would wait a beat too long before answering a direct question, like he was running the answer through a check of some kind before it left his mouth. And Soo-Jin started texting at the table, which she had never done. She'd always been very deliberate about putting her phone away at dinner.
How long did you observe this before you said anything? Or did you say anything?
I didn't say anything for a long time. I think, and I've thought about this a lot in the past 18 months, I've been in therapy. I've done a great deal of thinking. I think I told myself it was a rough patch. Every marriage has rough patches. Henry and I had rough patches. The 2nd year of our marriage, I thought we might not make it. Honestly, we did. So I thought they'll work through it. And I also think, and this is the part that's harder to say I didn't ask, because some part of me understood that asking would require me to hear the answer.
That's a very honest thing to say. The not asking as a kind of knowing.
the not asking as a kind of being afraid to know, which is different from not caring. I cared enormously. I just also was not ready, which I didn't know at the time. I thought I was just being respectful. I told myself I was giving them space, but I think I was also protecting myself from something I couldn't name.
What were the other things you noticed in that period?
Soo-Jin stopped painting. That was the one that, if I'm honest, that was the one that scared me the most. And I didn't let myself sit with why it scared me. She'd had a second show in the works. She'd been building toward it for over a year. And then somewhere around the fall of what turned out to be the last full year of the marriage, she stopped going to the studio. Kevin mentioned it once, quietly, while we were doing the dishes after Sunday dinner. He said, she's been taking a break from the painting. And the way he said it, there was something underneath it that I heard and couldn't name.
What do you mean you heard something underneath it?
It wasn't just information. It wasn't just she's been busy or she's shifting focus. There was a weight to it. Like he was telling me something much larger than the sentence contained. And I nodded and I kept washing the dish and I said, she'll come back to it. She always does. And he didn't respond. He just kept drying.
You're describing a lot of moments in which you picked up a signal and then made a choice, conscious or not, to set it back down.
I think that's the story of those 3 years. Yes. I think that's what those years were made of.
Was there a specific moment when the setting it down stopped working, when it became impossible to not see what you were seeing?
There was a Sunday, and I don't know exactly when this was, maybe 6 months before the call, maybe less when Soo-Jin came to dinner alone. Kevin had something for work, she said, which happened occasionally, not often. He usually made the Sunday dinners. And I remember she was wearing this sweater she'd had for years, very soft, the colour of a sky right after rain. And she sat at the table and she ate and she talked and she was perfectly fine and perfectly present. And I looked at her and I thought, she is somewhere else entirely. Not far away, not checked out in a rude way, just somewhere I could not follow. And the next week, Kevin came alone, said Soo-Jin was under the weather. And the week after that, they both came and nobody said anything. And I set it down again. And that became my Sunday routine. Picking up something I couldn't name, putting it back, passing the rice.
Picking it up, putting it back. That is such an honest description of what that kind of waiting feels like.
It is exhausting, even when you don't know you're doing it. When I look back at that year, I am genuinely tired by the memory of it. Even though at the time I thought I was fine.
I want to ask you about one more thing in this period before we get to the phone call itself. You mentioned Soo-Jin had stopped painting, that the second show she'd been building toward had stalled. Was there any conversation between you and Soo-Jin directly in that period, just the two of you, where you felt like you were close to something real?
Once. We had lunch, just us, at a place we used to go in Andersonville, a Korean restaurant she'd loved since she was a teenager. This would have been maybe 4 months before the call. And we were sitting across from each other and she was talking about work, a project she was finishing, a branding thing for a small company. She was describing the colour choices she'd made and she stopped mid-sentence, just stopped. And she looked at me and there was something in her face that I had not seen there before. Not sadness exactly, more like the way a door looks when someone is standing behind it.
What happened in that moment?
I asked her if she was okay, and she said yes. She said she was just tired. She said the project had been demanding. And then she asked me if I'd been following a particular artist she liked, someone who'd had a show recently at the MCA. And I said I hadn't. And she got out her phone and showed me images and we talked about the work for 20 minutes. And by the time we walked out of that restaurant, she seemed entirely herself. But I drove home thinking something is happening. I don't know what, but something is happening. And then I got home and Henry was making coffee and the sound of it was so familiar that I let it go again.
The sound of the coffee was familiar enough to make you stop asking.
The sound of the coffee was familiar enough to make everything else seem like maybe I was just being anxious. You know how that is. When your whole life smells like itself, it's hard to believe the smell might be about to change.
It's very hard. And yet, even though you let it go, some part of you had stopped fully believing the letting go.
Yes. Some part of me had started sitting very lightly on things. Like I was prepared, not consciously, but bodily prepared for something to shift. I just had no idea what the shift would be or how completely it would rearrange every room I knew.
Before we get to the night of the phone call, and I promise you we will get there, I want to ask you one more thing about this period of noticing. You've described picking up signals and setting them back down. You've described the Sunday dinners, the stop painting, the lunch in Andersonville. My question is this. In all of that time of noticing without naming, did any part of your mind, even the very edge of it, ever form the specific thought? Did any part of you ever think, even briefly, even in a way you immediately dismissed, that Soo-Jin might be gay?
I have asked myself that question every single day for the past 18 months. And I am telling you the truth when I say no. The word never came to me, not once. I thought trouble in the marriage. I thought depression, possibly. I thought work stress. I thought she's growing in a direction that doesn't include me. I thought everything except the true thing. And I don't know if that's because I wasn't capable of seeing it or because she was so careful. She was so extraordinarily careful that the possibility was simply never placed in front of me in a way I could find.
Is there anything you saw in retrospect that you think, if you had been looking for it, might have told you?
The brightness. In those early years, whenever she was around a woman, she felt a real connection with. Not often, and not obviously, but sometimes, a few times, there was that quality I described. That dial turning a degree or two. I noticed it at that dinner with Margot. I noticed it once at a gallery opening when she was talking to one of the other artists. I noticed it, and I translated it as, she has good chemistry with this person. Soo-Jin isn't an easy person to be immediately comfortable with. So when she was, I read it as friendship. I read it as relief. I read it as her finally finding her kind of people. I genuinely never read it as something else.
And do you think Soo-Jin knew in the years of the marriage? Do you think she knew what it was?
I think she suspected something. I think she had always, on some level, been aware of a discrepancy between who she was expected to be and who she might actually be. But I don't think she had the language for it. Or maybe she had the language and refused to let herself use it. I don't know. We haven't talked about it fully. We've talked around it. We are working toward talking about it. But I can't tell you what was inside her. I can only tell you what I saw from the outside. And from the outside, I saw a woman who was contained and careful and working very hard at a version of herself that may have been narrower than she actually was.
That image, a person working very hard at a version of themselves that's narrower than who they are, that's going to stay with me.
It stayed with me too. For a long time, it made me angry. Because I kept thinking, why couldn't she come to me? I am her mother. I wouldn't have. And then I stopped myself in that sentence. Because I can't be certain. I want to believe I would have been the mother who made it safe, but I can't be certain I was, or that she believed I was. And that uncertainty that's its own thing to sit with.
You're sitting with a lot of things.
I have a very large kitchen.
Tell me what was happening in the months right before the phone call. Not the day of it yet, the weeks before. What was the weather in your family?
She mentioned she had been sketching again, doing studies for something large. She was more present. And I remember at one Sunday dinner, maybe 6 weeks before the call, she said something that I filed away and forgot until much later. Strained, more openly strained than it had been. Kevin had stopped coming to Sunday dinners entirely. Soo-Jin was coming occasionally. And when she did, she was different again, lighter, actually, which was confusing to me. I had expected, if things were falling apart in the marriage, that she would seem more burdened. But she seemed, on some evenings, almost released. There was colour in her again. That sounds strange to say, but she was talking more about her work.
What did she say?
And she smiled. And that was 6 weeks before the call. She said, "Mum, I think I've been afraid of the wrong things for a long time." And I asked her what she meant. And she said, "I don't know yet, but I'm figuring it out." And she said it like a person who was, in fact, figuring something out. Not like someone drowning, like someone coming up for air. And I thought, okay, she's going through something, but she's going to be all right. And I didn't ask more. I just put more rice in her bowl and said, you've always figured things out.
6 weeks before the call, she tells you she's been afraid of the wrong things, and she seems coming up for air, and you have no idea what is coming.
I have no idea what is coming.
And then the call comes.
And then the call comes.
You said some part of you had stopped fully believing the letting go, that you were sitting very lightly on things, and yet you still didn't name what you were worried about. I want to understand the inside of that, because I think a lot of people who are listening right now have been in some version of that place where you know something is wrong, but you can't make yourself go to the specific fear. What was happening inside you in that time, not what you observed, what you felt.
I felt like I was standing in a room where I knew there was a door, but I couldn't see it. It was there. I was certain it was there. But every time I moved toward where I thought it was, I found wall. And after a while, you stop moving toward it. Not because you don't want to find it, but because the wall is so consistent that you start to wonder if maybe you invented the door. Maybe there is no door. Maybe this is just how rooms are.
How long did you live in that room?
2 years, probably, maybe 2.5. The whole back half of the marriage, honestly, the last 18 months or so, I was very aware that I was choosing not to look directly at something. I knew that much. I knew I was choosing. I just couldn't choose differently. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. You couldn't choose differently because choosing differently would require you to be ready for what you might find. And you weren't ready.
I wasn't ready. And I think, and this is something my therapist has been very patient with me about, I wasn't ready because I still thought of my job as the person who held the shape of this family. The house runs because I make it run. The Sundays happen because I plan them. The rice is in the bowl because I put it there. And if I looked at the door and the door opened onto something I didn't know how to navigate, then who holds the shape? You know, who makes sure everybody's okay?
You carried the structure of the family, and so you couldn't afford to be the one who shook it.
That is the most accurate sentence I have heard in 18 months of therapy.
Did you and Henry talk about what you were both observing? Were you in this uncertainty together, or were you in it alone?
Mostly alone. Henry noticed things too, I'm sure of it, but Henry processes things very internally. He comes to conclusions quietly and then presents them when they're finished. He doesn't do the middle part out loud. And in that period, I didn't bring it to him because I think I was afraid that naming it to Henry would make it real in a way I couldn't take back. As long as it was only in my own head, this shapeless worry, this unnamed thing, it could still be wrong. I could still be wrong. The moment I said it to Henry, it would have to be something.
So you were each carrying it privately.
We were each carrying it privately in the same kitchen, which sounds like a small tragedy, but is also just how a lot of marriages work, I think. You share space and silence, and you each tend your own version of the fear.
I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to go here if you're not ready. But in all that private carrying, in the middle of the night, the early morning, the moments when nobody was watching, did you ever let yourself form the specific thought, not about Soo-Jin yet, but about the marriage? Did you ever think, Kevin and Soo-Jin are not in love anymore, and I don't know why?
I thought that, yes, I thought that many times. I thought the current is gone. That calibration I used to feel between them at the table, it was gone. They were polite. They were kind to each other in the way that people are when kindness is the only thing left that's safe. But the thing that was underneath it, whatever makes two people want to be in the same room, I couldn't find it anymore. And that frightened me because I had believed in that. I had stood at that wedding and felt it. And watching it go quiet, it was like watching a kind of winter settle in and knowing it was not the kind that thaws.
And when you felt that particular grief of watching something go quiet, what did you do with it?
I made more food. I planned more Sundays. I arranged things. I kept the structure of the family so intact and so functional that maybe the inside would follow. Maybe if the table was set properly and the food was good and everyone had a reason to show up, maybe something would be preserved or reconstructed or at least kept alive long enough for them to find their way back.
You try to hold it in place through love and logistics.
I have been holding things in place through love and logistics for 31 years. It is the only tool I have.
But this time it didn't work.
This time, the thing that needed fixing was not something a Sunday dinner could reach.
There's something you said earlier that I keep coming back to. You said that in the months just before the phone call, Soo-Jin seemed lighter, more present, like she had color again. And you said she told you she'd been afraid of the wrong things. I want to sit with the strangeness of that she seemed to be getting better at the exact moment the marriage was ending. What do you make of that now?
Now I understand it completely. Then it confused and frightened me in equal measure. Because I thought, if she's okay, why does something still feel so wrong? Why does she seem lighter but the house still feel like it's about to shift? And the answer, which I only understand in retrospect, is that she was lighter. She was coming out of something. She had begun the process of telling herself the truth. And that truth was liberating her, even as it was dismantling everything around her. The lightness was real. It was just real for reasons I didn't know yet.
The lightness was real. It was just real for reasons you didn't know.
The worst part is, I was glad to see it. I was glad she seemed better. I thought it meant things were going to be okay. I thought the winter was ending. I didn't know I was watching the first morning of a completely different season.
And then the call came on a Sunday night.
On a Sunday night, yes. After dinner, I had cleaned up. Henry was in the living room watching something. And I was actually going through the grocery list for the week, which is the detail that stays with me. The grocery list. I had a pen in my hand. I was writing down that we needed more ginger root and a new bottle of sesame oil. And the phone rang.
And it was Kevin.
And it was Kevin. And I knew from the sound of his voice, just hello, just one word, I knew that something was broken. Not just strained, not just tired, broken. His voice had the texture of something that had already gone through the worst part and was now just trying to exist on the other side of it.
What did he say?
He said he needed to tell me something. He said he was sorry. He said he was sorry that this was how I was finding out. And he was sorry that he was the one telling me, but that Soo-Jin couldn't. And he stopped there. Couldn't what? I asked. And he went quiet for a very long time. And then he said, Diane, I have to tell you why we're getting a divorce, because somebody in your family needs to know. And she can't tell you herself yet. And I think you deserve to know. And I put down the pen and I sat down. And the grocery list was still in front of me.
Take your time.
He said, and I remember every single word of this, I will remember it until I die. He said, Soo-Jin is gay. She has always been gay. And she has spent 30 years not knowing how to say it. And she finally couldn't not say it anymore. And I love her. I love her so much. And I want her to be happy. But I can't be her husband anymore. And she can't be my wife. Because she never, and then he stopped. And he didn't finish the sentence. And I didn't need him to.
What happened inside you in that moment?
Nothing. That's the truest answer. Nothing happened. The world continued. The refrigerator hummed. I could hear the television from the other room. Henry laughing at something. And I was sitting at the kitchen table with a grocery list in front of me. And the information that my daughter was gay, that she had always been gay, that she had been married for 4 years to a man who loved her and who she loved and who was now dissolving on the phone in front of me. And inside me there was nothing. A white room. A completely white room with nothing in it.
Not shock, not grief, just nothing.
Just nothing. Like the circuit went dark. Like the part of me that processes things looked at what had just arrived and simply couldn't. Not yet. Not right then. Maybe not for a while.
How long did you stay on the phone with Kevin?
An hour. Maybe more. He talked for a long time and I listened. And I asked some things and he answered them. He told me they had separated 3 months earlier, which I hadn't known, or hadn't let myself know, which amounts to the same thing. He told me Soo-Jin had come out to him before she came out to herself, which doesn't make logical sense, and yet Kevin said it, and I understood exactly what he meant. She had said the words to him before. She had been able to fully receive them in herself. He told me she was okay, that she was safe, that she was staying with a friend in Logan Square, that she had been in therapy for 6 months. He told me she wanted to tell me herself. He told me she just couldn't yet. And he said, Diane, I'm telling you because I don't want you to be the last person. You're her mother. You shouldn't be the last person.
He was protecting you in his own way while his own life was falling apart.
That's exactly what he was doing. And in that moment, I could not feel the full weight of that. I know it now. I think about Kevin differently now than I did that night. That night, he was just the voice that had broken my world open. But looking back, that was an extraordinary act of love. Not for Soo-Jin, for me. He made that call because he thought I deserved to know before it arrived any other way. He could have said nothing. He could have let Soo-Jin manage her own timeline. He didn't. Because he thought about what I would feel being the last to know. And he couldn't let that happen to me.
And then you hung up.
And then I said thank you, which is the strangest thing. I said thank you to my son-in-law for telling me my daughter was gay. And I hung up and I sat in the kitchen. And the grocery list was still there. And I didn't move.
For how long?
Until sunrise. The whole night. I sat in that kitchen until the sky went pale outside the window over the sink. Henry came down around 2 a.m. to get water and found me sitting there, and I told him something was wrong and I needed to sit a while longer, and he looked at me, and Henry, God bless him, he knows when I need him to wait, and he touched my shoulder and went back upstairs. And I sat there until the light came.
What were you doing in all those hours? What was happening inside you while you sat there?
At first, nothing. The white room. For maybe the first hour, it was just white and quiet, and I couldn't form a single coherent thought. And then, very slowly, things started to arrive. Not big thoughts, small ones. I thought about the lunch in Andersonville and the way she'd looked at me with the door behind her eyes. I thought about the brightness I'd seen at Margot's table. I thought about Wicker Park, the gallery opening, that other artist she'd talked with, and the way she'd been lit up afterward. I thought about every sketchbook she'd ever had and what she'd drawn in them and whether I'd looked carefully enough. I thought about the dress at the wedding ivory, no ornamentation, and I thought she wasn't becoming, she was hiding. She was hiding and smiling and marrying a good man who loved her and hiding some more. And she had been doing that hiding for 30 years, inside my house, inside my sight, within reach of me, and I had not seen it.
What did that feel like, that realization that the hiding had been happening that close to you?
Like failure. That's the first word. Failure. I thought I failed her. I was supposed to be the person she could come to. I was supposed to be safe. And she could not come to me. She could not trust me with the most essential truth of who she was. And she had lived inside that for 30 years, and I had never made it easy enough for her to lay it down.
Did that feeling stay? The feeling of failure?
It stayed for a long time. It still visits, but it has changed shape. I've come to understand that my not knowing was not the same as her not trusting me. It was more complicated than that. It was the world she had grown up in. It was the family she had grown up in, the culture, the language around her, the fact that in our house we didn't talk about these things, not because we were hostile to them, but because they simply never came up. And she may have interpreted that silence as not safe, not unwelcoming, just not a space that had been cleared for it. And that is something I could have done differently. I could have made that space. I wish I had made that space. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but I wish I had.
You're sitting in the kitchen until sunrise, arriving at all of this. At some point, the sun comes up. What do?
I make coffee. I don't drink it. I make it because making it is something I know how to do with my hands. And then I sit with a cup and I think, do I call her right now or do I wait? Do I call her and say, I know, please come home? Or do I wait for her to come to me in her own time? And I sit with that question for the next 3 days.
3 days?
3 days. And it's that question, the call or the wait, that I think is the truest question of the whole story. Because both choices contained love and both choices contained fear. And I didn't know, I still don't know fully which one would have been right.
Diane, I need to just sit with what you just described for a moment. Because I think everyone listening right now is sitting in their own version of that kitchen. That's the thing about this story. It's not about a phone call. It's about 3 days of not knowing whether to reach out or wait. It's about 30 years of a daughter holding something that should have been easier to put down. and a mother sitting in the dark making coffee she doesn't drink. If any of that has landed somewhere in your chest tonight, if you have lived any version of this story from any chair in any kitchen, I want to ask you to do one thing. Leave a comment below, not with an answer, but with whatever this opened in you. This is a community. The comments on this channel are one of the things I'm most proud of. And we're going to hear from some of them in a little while. But first, we're going to stay with Diane, because we are nowhere near done. 3 days. You're sitting with the question of whether to call or wait. And Soo-Jin has not called you. Kevin has called you. Henry now knows. Does Ellen know at this point?
Ellen didn't know for another week. That was Soo-Jin's choice to make, not mine. I told Henry the morning after the call. I came upstairs when the sun was fully up, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I told him, and Henry sat very still for a very long time, and then he said, "Is she okay?" And that was his first question. Not what does this mean? Not I can't believe it. Not any of the things I might have expected. Just, is she okay? And I said I didn't know, and he nodded. And then he said, then that's the first thing.
That was Henry's response. Is she okay? Then that's the first thing.
That is my husband. That is who he is. I have spent 31 years, sometimes frustrated by how slowly he arrives at things and how little he says on the way. And then he says something like that, and I understand exactly why I married him.
How were you in the 3 days of waiting? Not the big philosophical question, the actual physical days. What did you do? What did your body do?
I functioned. I cooked. I went to the grocery store. I actually used the grocery list. I bought the ginger root. I bought the sesame oil. I did the laundry. I answered emails. From the outside, I was completely normal. From the inside, I was not inside my body at all. I was somewhere slightly above and behind it, watching it move through the house, doing the tasks it always did. My hands knew what to do without me. I didn't have to be present for any of it.
Dissociation.
I didn't have that word for it then. My therapist gave me the word later. But yes, that's what it was. I was elsewhere, still performing the life, but not inhabiting it.
Did you sleep?
A little. Not well. I'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning and lie there making arguments in my head, the case for calling, the case for waiting. I went through every possible version of the phone call. Every sentence, I might say. Every way she might respond. I rehearsed it so many times that by the 3rd day, the conversation felt like something that had already happened.
Did you talk to anyone during those 3 days? Friends, a therapist, anyone?
No. I didn't have a therapist then. I have one now. And I didn't tell any friends. Because it wasn't my story to tell. It was Soo-Jin's. Whatever I was carrying, the carrying of it was mine to do quietly. Because the truth of it belonged to her. That still feels like the right choice. Even though it was lonely.
The right choice. Even though it was lonely.
Even though it was very, very lonely, I had Henry. Henry is not a person who says many things. But he was there in the kitchen in the morning, making coffee the right way. And sometimes he'd put his hand on mine at the table and we'd sit together in the quiet, and that was enough. That was actually enough.
And then on the 3rd day?
On the 3rd day, she called me.
What time?
7 in the evening. I was in the kitchen. I'm always in the kitchen. That's a pattern I have noticed. And the phone rang, and it was her. And the first thing she said was, "Mum, I'm so sorry." And something broke in me. Not the wrong kind of breaking, the kind of breaking that lets something out.
What did you say?
I said, "I know, Kevin called me, and I want you to listen to me very carefully, Soo-Jin." And she said, "Okay." And I said, "I love you. I have loved you since before you were born. And nothing that is true about who you are could change that. Do you understand me? Nothing."
That was your first sentence.
That was my first sentence. I had rehearsed 40 other sentences. That was the one that came out.
How did she respond?
She cried. She cried for a long time. And I cried. And we were both on the phone crying. And neither of us said anything for several minutes. And I thought, 30 years. She carried this for 30 years, and I was right here. I was in this kitchen, making food, planning Sundays, waiting for her to tell me, and she was carrying it alone. And now we are both crying on the phone in our separate kitchens, and maybe this is just what the beginning of the other side looks like.
You said something interesting. You said, maybe this is just what the beginning of the other side looks like. Was there a part of you, even in that moment, that was also somewhere else? That was angry or grieving or afraid?
All of those things were present, every single one of them. I was relieved and I was devastated and I was angry and I was full of love and I was terrified about what happened next. They were all there simultaneously. That's the thing nobody tells you about these moments. It's not one feeling. It's like every feeling you have ever had trying to use the same door at the same time. There is no room. There is no order. There is just this noise inside that you hold very still and don't let out, because the person on the other end of the phone needs to hear your voice be steady.
And you held it steady.
I held it steady as I could for her. And then we hung up and I put the phone down on the counter and I sat down very slowly and I let some of the noise out quietly into the kitchen. The kitchen has heard a lot from me this past year and a half.
The kitchen knows everything.
The kitchen knows everything.
You said every feeling trying to use the same door. I want to walk through some of those feelings with you now because I don't want to skip over them. The night of the call and the days that followed, there was relief, you said, and love. But there was also anger. I want to ask about the anger. Who were you angry at?
That changed. The anger moved around. At first, and I'm not proud of this, but it's true, I was angry at Soo-Jin. Not for being gay. I want to be very clear about that. Never for that, but for the years of silence, for standing in that kitchen at 30 years old, telling me she'd been afraid of the wrong things and still not saying the true thing. For the years I spent folding laundry next to a secret I didn't know I was living next to. I was angry that I hadn't been trusted. I was angry that she had made a choice about what I could handle and had decided, without asking me, that I couldn't handle the truth.
That's a significant anger. The anger of not being trusted with someone's truth.
It's a complicated anger because I understand it. I understand why she didn't say it. I understand the world she grew up in and the family she grew up in and the way that silence accumulates. I understand all of that intellectually, and I was still angry. You can understand something completely and still be wounded by it. Those are not the same thing.
Who else were you angry at?
Myself. For a long time, I was most angry at myself. For all the signals I didn't follow. For the times I watched her go quiet and told myself it was just her nature. For the lunch in Andersonville when she had the door behind her eyes and I let her redirect me to an artist's Instagram and drove home and heard the coffee and let it go. I was furious at myself for having a tool, my own attention, my own instincts, the particular language of my daughter that I had been reading for 30 years and choosing again and again not to use it.
Did the anger at yourself feel fair, looking back now?
It felt real. Whether it was fair is a harder question. My therapist would say no. My therapist would say I was operating with the information I had and the readiness I had, and that you cannot expect yourself to see what you are not prepared to see. And I believe that in my head. I believe it about 80% of the way. The other 20% still sits in the kitchen at 3 a.m. and tells me I should have asked better questions.
Tell me about the weeks immediately after that first phone call with Soo-Jin. What did the family look like? What were the conversations like?
Fragile, very fragile. Soo-Jin came to the house about 4 days after the call. Just her, no, Kevin, of course, and Henry and I were both home. And that was one of the hardest mornings. She came in the front door and she looked like someone who had been through something enormous and had survived it but hadn't slept properly in months, which was true. She had shadows under her eyes and she had lost weight and she was wearing the same rain sky sweater I'd seen her in at that Sunday dinner when she'd seemed so far away. And she stood in the doorway and she looked at me and she said, "Hi, Mum." And I crossed the kitchen and I hugged her and I said, "Come sit down. I made doenjang jjigae."
Of course you did.
Of course I did. It is what I do. If there is a crisis, there is food. Henry was quieter than usual, which is saying something. He hugged her when she came in, and he didn't let go for a long time. And then he stepped back and looked at her face and nodded, like something had been confirmed for him. Like, yes, this is still my daughter. Same face, same person, confirmed. And then he went to the living room and gave us the kitchen.
He gave you the kitchen.
He always knows when to give us the kitchen.
What happened in that conversation?
She talked a lot for Soo-Jin, more than I had heard her talk in years. She told me she said since she was very young, she used the word known loosely. She said it was more like a weight she carried that she could never put down and never name. She said she had thought for a long time that if she just made the right choices and built the right life, the weight would become manageable. She had loved Kevin. She told me that very clearly, very earnestly, she had loved him. She had wanted to love him the way he deserved. She had tried, and she had failed. And the failure had cost him enormously. And the knowing that she had cost him something was one of the hardest parts.
She was grieving Kevin's loss while also being freed.
Exactly. And the guilt of that freedom was enormous. She said, I ruined his life. I took his 30s. I owe him something I can never give back. And I said, Kevin loves you. Kevin called me, so I wouldn't be the last to know. Kevin is going to be okay. And she said, how do you know? And I said, because he is the kind of person who would make that call. People like that land on their feet. And she went quiet for a while, and then she said, I should have told you years ago. And I said, yes, you should have. And I should have made it easier for you. And we are both going to have to sit with those two things being true at the same time.
Both things being true at the same time.
She looked at me when I said that, like it was something she hadn't expected to hear, like she had come in braced for a different kind of conversation. And I thought, this is what 30 years of silence looks like when it begins to move. It looks like two people looking at each other across a kitchen table, both of them carrying something they should have been able to put down sooner, finally beginning to put it down.
Was there any moment in that first conversation where you lost your steadiness, where the grief or the anger came through despite you?
Once. She said something. She said, I wish I'd been someone who could have been honest from the beginning. I wish I'd been braver. And I said, and I didn't mean for it to come out the way it did. I said, so do I. And the room went very quiet. And she looked down, and I said, I'm sorry, that wasn't fair. And she said, no, it's okay, it's true. And we sat with that for a minute. And then I refilled her bowl, and she let me.
She let you refill her bowl.
She let me refill her bowl, which sounds small, but for Soo-Jin, accepting care has never been easy. She has always managed herself. She has always said she was fine before you could ask. The fact that she let me put more soup in her bowl felt like the first real thing that had passed between us in years. The first thing that was just mother and daughter. Not the performance of it. The thing itself.
How did Henry process it in the days that followed? You said he's internal, he arrives at conclusions quietly. What did that look like in this situation?
He took 3 days. He was quiet, he was present, he went about his life. He made the coffee correctly. On the third day, he came into the kitchen in the evening when I was cooking, and he sat down at the table and he said, I've been thinking about Soo-Jin. And I said, I know. And he said, she must have been so tired. And those 5 words were the entirety of his processing. And they were exactly right. She must have been so tired. That's Henry. He got there in 3 days, and he got there to the true thing.
She must have been so tired. That's the whole of it, isn't it?
That's the whole of it, in 5 words.
What about Ellen? When did she find out, and how did she take it?
Ellen found out about a week later when Soo-Jin called her. I don't know the details of that conversation. It was between them, and I've chosen to leave it there. What I know is that Ellen called me right after. And the first thing Ellen said was, did you know? And I said, no. And she was quiet for a second. And then she said, that makes me so sad for her, Mum. All those years of not knowing if we'd be okay with it. And that's Ellen. Her first instinct is not about herself. It's outward. It's toward her sister.
How did Ellen's response affect you?
It made me cry. I was already in the kitchen, always the kitchen, and I sat down and I cried because I had been so afraid in those first weeks that this would fracture the family, that there would be sides and silences and fracture lines. And here was Ellen, 24 years old at the time, not skipping over her own shock, but going straight to her sister's experience of it. And I thought, we did something right. I don't know exactly what, but something.
That's a gift to receive in the middle of all the hard.
It was. It arrived when I needed it most. Not from where I expected. I expected the hard things to come from unexpected places. I did not expect the easy things to arrive so cleanly.
I want to ask about the months that followed, because you've described the call, the first conversation, the family learning. But then there's all the after, the daily after, the weeks when the shock has worn off enough to be replaced by the actual reality of the situation. What did that look like for you?
Long. It looked very long. The divorce proceedings started. Kevin and Soo-Jin had already been separated. So legally it was a matter of time, but emotionally it was still being assembled. Soo-Jin was finding her footing. She was still with a friend in Logan Square. She wasn't ready to be alone yet. I didn't hear from Kevin for about 2 months after that first call, which I understood. He needed distance. He needed to grieve without having to manage the Park's feelings while he did it.
Did you maintain contact with Kevin through those months?
A few texts, very brief. I said once, "I think about you, I hope you're finding your way." He said, "Same to you." That was the whole of it, but it felt sufficient. It felt like two people who had been in the same explosion acknowledging each other across the wreckage.
What was the hardest part of those months? Not the sharpest pain, but the one that wore you down most consistently?
The not knowing how to act. I didn't know what Soo-Jin needed from me. I didn't know how much space to give and how much presence. I didn't want to crowd her with my own feelings. She was already carrying enough. But I also didn't want her to feel like I'd gone quiet on her, like I was processing her the way she had always been processed, from a distance, managed. So I was constantly calibrating. Every phone call, every Sunday dinner, every text message, I was thinking, is this too much? Is this not enough? Does she need me to ask more or ask less? And there was no instruction manual. There was no right amount.
You were navigating something with no map.
With no map, and with the awareness that the stakes were very high, that if I got the calibration wrong in either direction, too smothering, too withdrawn, it would set something back that I could not afford to set back. Because this was the first real conversation Soo-Jin and I had ever had. The real one. The one underneath all the Sundays and the Doenjang jjigae and the sketchbooks. The first time she was allowing me to actually see her. And I could not afford to flinch. I refused to flinch.
You refused to flinch.
I refused. Not because I didn't feel like flinching sometimes, but because I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, the person she actually was, not the person I'd been understanding her as. And what I saw was someone who had been waiting a very long time to be looked at without flinching. And I was not going to be the person who finally got the privilege of that and then turned away. I would not do that, no matter what was happening inside me.
What was happening inside you in that period? What were you tending privately in the spaces where she couldn't see?
Grief. A specific kind of grief that I find hard to explain. I was not grieving the loss of Soo-Jin. She was right there. More present, in fact, than she had been in years. The real her, finally. But I was grieving a version of her future that I had been holding in my mind without knowing I was holding it. The daughter-in-law I had imagined, the grandchildren that weren't going to come from that marriage, the particular shape of the future I had been carrying in a quiet place in my mind since she was small, I was grieving that. And I felt guilty for grieving it, because those were my projections, not her obligations. Her life is not my picture of it. Her life is hers. And I knew that. And I still grieved the picture. And the grief was real, even though the picture was never rightfully mine.
That grief is real. And it's also a grief that isn't often named the grief of a future that was always imaginary, a picture of someone else's life that you'd been living inside.
It was the most private grief. I couldn't say it to her. How could I? I couldn't say, I'm grieving the life I imagined for you, as though the life you're actually living is somehow less. That would have been wrong and cruel. So I grieved it in the kitchen. I grieved it in the car. I grieved it at 3 a.m. And slowly, over months, I began to release the picture, to put it down. Not because the grief finished, but because I began to replace it with something realer. With the actual Soo-Jin, with her actual life, with the fact that she was sketching again, drawing studies, that she was more alive than she had been in years. And I began to think that picture I was grieving was not her anyway. It was never her. It was a costume I had sewn for her in my mind, and she had been trying to wear it for 30 years and it had never fit. And she was finally out of it. And she looked like herself. For the first time, like herself.
Let me ask you about something specific you said. You said the community around you, your social world, reacted to all of this in ways you didn't fully anticipate. Tell me about that.
Our community in Chicago is mostly Korean American families we've known for years, church community, some neighbors, friends from Henry's engineering world. And the reactions they sorted themselves, I found, into 3 groups. The first group said nothing. They already knew somehow things travel in communities, and they simply continued. Invited us to things, talked about other things. The silence was kind, I think.
And the second group?
It was the silence of, we are not going to make you perform this for us. The second group came to me. Some came with casseroles, which I found very funny. We are Korean. We don't really do casseroles. But the gesture was American and warm, and I received the casseroles gratefully. Some came with their version of support, which sometimes meant saying things like, I'm praying for Soo-Jin, in a way that meant different things depending on who was saying it. I learned to hear those prayers as love, even when the theology inside them made me tired. Most of the time it was love, complicated love, but love.
And the third group?
The third group is the one I had not anticipated. There were 2 families, people we had known for a long time, people I had eaten dinner with, people whose children had grown up alongside ours, who went quiet in a different way. Not the kind silence of the first group. The kind of quiet that means we do not know how to be near this, we do not know how to place this in our understanding, and so they placed themselves elsewhere. Dinners stopped being suggested. Phone calls were shorter and less frequent. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a slow, polite withdrawal, like tide going out.
How did that feel?
Like something I hadn't expected. And that was, in its way, the hardest part of all of it, not the anger, not my grief, not even the worry about Soo-Jin. The hardest part was sitting in a kitchen that used to be full of noise from a particular community and feeling the quiet where some of that noise used to be and knowing it was because my daughter is gay. That is a very specific kind of loneliness. The kind where you look around at what your life was built from and some of it has simply relocated. Without asking your permission.
I want to come back to the thing that arrived unexpectedly, because you said earlier something about support coming from somewhere you hadn't anticipated. Who came that you didn't expect?
Kevin's mother, Margaret. She lives in Indiana. Kevin's family is from Fort Wayne. I had met her at the wedding, at a few family occasions over the years. Pleasant, but not close. She called me about 6 weeks after I found out. She said, Diane, I want you to know that my son is going to be okay, and your daughter is going to be okay, and you are going to be okay, and the 4 of us are going to figure out how to hold this. 4 of us, she meant herself, me, Kevin, Soo-Jin, the 4 people whose lives had been most rearranged. And she talked to me for an hour, and she cried with me, and she had no obligation to do that. None. She could have stayed in her world and managed her own grief about her son's marriage ending. But she called me, and then she called me again 3 weeks later, and again a month after that. We talk monthly now, Margaret and I. She is one of the only people in my life who understands this specific shape of this particular loss from a specific angle that has nothing to do with Soo-Jin's being gay and everything to do with watching a marriage that you believed in end in a way nobody planned.
An unexpected ally?
An unexpected, extraordinary ally from Fort Wayne, Indiana. I did not see that coming.
Diane, there is something underneath everything you've described in these months that I want to name, because I think it matters. In all of this, the anger, the grief, the calibrating, the polite withdrawals, the unexpected allies, there is a consistent thread. You held on to Soo-Jin. You did not flinch. You chose her again and again in every small calibration and every hard conversation. I want to ask, was there a moment, even a moment, where you almost didn't, where something pulled you toward a different choice?
There was a night, maybe 3 months in, we had had a difficult conversation, one of the first honest ones, about the years of hiding, about why she hadn't come to me. And some things were said that were true and that still hurt. And I went home and I sat in the kitchen and I thought, I don't know if I can keep doing this at the rate it asks. I was exhausted, the kind of exhausted that goes into the bone. And I thought, just for a moment, just for that night, I thought maybe I need to put this down for a while. Maybe I need to say to her, give me some time. And I looked at the counter. The grocery list was gone, different list, different week, but the counter was there, the kitchen was the same kitchen, and I thought about her at 7 years old, sitting in a corner with her sketchbook, markers in a very specific order, her system for everything. The way she had a system, because the world had not yet given her a language. And I thought, she has been putting it down for 30 years. She has been putting it down every day of her life. I can hold it for one more night.
And you did.
And I did. And then I made coffee. I didn't drink. And I sat there until I felt steady enough to go to bed. And that was the only night I came close to putting it down.
You said that night was the only night you came close to putting it down, and you didn't. And then the weeks turned into months. I want to ask you about the actual texture of that time, the months when the acute crisis had passed, but the reconstruction hadn't really begun yet. Not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. What did your days actually look like?
Empty in a way I had not expected. That surprised me more than anything, because my days had always been full. The house, the cooking, the planning, the Sundays, the errands, Henry's schedule, the girls' schedules. I had always been the person who knew where everything was and when everything needed to happen. And then Soo-Jin was not coming for Sunday dinner every week. The divorce was proceeding. Ellen was in Evanston, deep in her coursework. Henry was retired and present, but self-sufficient in the quiet way. He has always been self-sufficient. And I found myself in this house that still ran perfectly. I made sure of that, the house ran perfectly, but that ran with a surplus of space I did not know what to do with.
What did you do with the surplus?
At first, nothing useful. I reorganized things that didn't need reorganizing. I cleaned out a closet that was already reasonably clean. I made food for neighbours under the guise of having made too much, which was not entirely untrue, but was also not the real reason. I had not read for pleasure in years. There was always something more pressing, and I started picking up books again, slowly at first, then more steadily. I read things about psychology, some, because I was trying to understand what Soo-Jin had gone through, but also novels, things I'd read decades ago and wanted to return to. There was a particular Tuesday in November, this would have been about 4 months after the call, when I sat in the kitchen in the afternoon with a cup of tea, that actually stayed warm long enough for me to finish it, and a book I had been reading for 3 weeks, and I read for 2 hours without once feeling like I should be doing something else.
That Tuesday in November, 2 hours of reading without guilt.
2 hours. The tea stayed warm. The light through the window over the sink was that flat winter light that Chicago does, grey and steady. And I sat there in it and I read and I thought, I can breathe right now. This is breathing. This small, still thing is breathing. And I cried a little, actually. Not from grief, from the surprise of it. From the realization that I had not sat still in that house without performing some function for it in so long that the simple act of sitting felt like a discovery.
You wept from the surprise of being still.
I wept from the surprise, yes, which tells you a great deal about the years that preceded it, I think, about the amount of holding I had been doing without knowing that was what the holding was costing.
Tell me about therapy. When did you start, and what brought you to it?
About 2 months after the call. It was Margaret, actually Kevin's mother, who suggested it, very gently, during one of our early calls. She said she had started seeing someone herself, and that it had been useful to have a place where she was the subject, not the caretaker, not the one managing the situation, just the subject, someone whose job it was to pay attention to her. And I thought, I I have never had that. I have been paying attention to other people for 31 years, and I have never sat in a room where paying attention to me was someone's actual job. And I made an appointment, and I went, and the first thing my therapist said, her name is Claire, she's in Lincoln Park. The first thing she said was, tell me what you need right now. Not what happened, not the story. What do you need right now? And I stared at her for a long time because I genuinely did not know. I had not been asked that question in so long that the answer had stopped being available to me.
You had to relearn the answer to that question.
Over about 6 months of weekly sessions, yes. I had to relearn how to be a person who had needs, not just a person who met them. That is harder than it sounds, especially when you are good at the meeting. When the meeting is something you do with real love and genuine skill, I didn't need to stop doing it. I needed to also be on the list. I needed to be one of the people I was taking care of.
What was the most important thing you came to understand about yourself in that period?
In the family. I am the one who calls, who reaches out, who tracks the birthdays and asks the questions. But I came to understand in therapy that there is a very specific class of question I had never learned to ask. The kind that opens a door you might not be able to close again. I could ask, how are you? Are you eating? How's the project going? Do you need anything? But I could not ask, what is the thing you are not telling me? I could not ask, I noticed something behind your eyes today. What is it? Because those questions require you to be ready for an answer you cannot predict or control. And I, who had controlled the shape of this family so carefully for so long, was not able to bear that uncertainty. So I never asked. And Soo-Jin grew up in a house where certain questions were never asked. And she learned from that silence that certain answers were not invited.
That is a very clear-eyed thing to understand about yourself.
It took 6 months and a very patient woman named Claire to arrive at it. I don't claim it easily.
Were you in contact with Soo-Jin through these months? How did that relationship evolve?
Slowly, carefully. She called more than she used to, which felt like a gift every time. We started doing a standing phone call on Wednesday evenings, just the two of us. Nothing structured, just talking. It was awkward at first. We had never been phone call people. We'd always been in-person people. And suddenly we were trying to build a different kind of closeness across the distance she needed from the family home while she was figuring herself out. But it got easier. The calls got longer. She started telling me things she had never told me before. Not the big revelations, those had passed, but the small daily things, the details of her life that she'd always kept to herself. She'd describe what she was cooking, what neighborhood she'd walked through that morning, what a color in a project at work was giving her trouble, the small things. And I understood those small things were the real things. The small things were her way of saying, I am letting you in now. This is what letting you in looks like. These details of my Tuesday.
Was there a specific moment in those months of slow rebuilding when you felt something shift? Not resolve shift, when the weight of the whole thing changed shape in some important way?
Yes. It was a Sunday in early spring, maybe 8 months after the call. I had gone to the farmer's market near our house, which I try to do every week when the weather allows. And I was walking home with a bag of things and I had my earbuds in, listening to nothing actually, just the quiet of them in. And I walked past a coffee shop on Clark Street and I saw Soo-Jin inside. She hadn't seen me. She was sitting at a small table by the window with a woman I didn't recognize, younger than her, I thought, or maybe the same age, hard to tell. And they were both leaning over something on the table, a large sketchbook open flat between them. And Soo-Jin was pointing at something on the page and the other woman was laughing, her whole face laughing. And Soo-Jin had that quality, that dial turned 2 degrees, and it was not directed at me and it was not for my benefit, and she had no idea I was there.
What did you do?
I stood on the sidewalk for maybe 30 seconds, just watching. And I felt something moved in my chest. Something that had been in a fist for 8 months, unclenched very slightly. Because she was happy. She was actually happy. Not performing happiness. I know the difference now. Actually happy. Leaning over a sketchbook in a coffee shop on a Sunday morning, this woman's face laughing at whatever she had pointed to on the page. And I thought, this is what she was supposed to have all along. This is the life that fits. And I walked home and I put the vegetables in the refrigerator and I made a cup of tea and I stood at the window over the sink for a long time. And for the first time since October, I did not cry. I just stood there, steady. The way you feel when something you've been holding in tension finally goes slack.
Something in a fist, unclenching.
That's exactly how it felt. Exactly.
Did you tell her you'd seen her?
I texted her that evening. I said, I walked past Clark Street this morning and saw you through the window of a coffee shop and you looked like yourself. She didn't respond for about 2 hours. And then she wrote, you should have come in. And I wrote, I know, I didn't want to interrupt. And she wrote, Mum, you're never an interruption. And I saved that text. I still have it.
You're never an interruption.
I read it probably once a week. I'm not embarrassed to say that.
Tell me about the painting, yours and hers. You mentioned early on that you hadn't been in your studio much this past year and a half. What happened there?
I stopped going in right after the call, right after everything arrived. I just stopped. Not consciously, not as a decision. I would walk past the door and not open it. Some days I would stand outside it and think, I should go in. And then I'd go make food instead. The studio became a kind of closed room in my mind to match the closed thing I was carrying. I think I needed all my attention pointed outward toward the people I was trying to hold. And the painting takes something inward, something that asks you to be only in yourself for a while. And I couldn't afford to be only in myself. So I left the studio dark.
When did you go back in?
About 7 months after the call, it was one of those nights Henry gave me the kitchen. And he wasn't home, actually. He was at a neighbour's, some engineering club thing they do on Thursday evenings. And the house was completely quiet. And I walked past the studio door. And this time, I didn't stand outside it. I just opened it and went in. And it smelt like paint and linseed oil and the particular dust of a room that hasn't been disturbed in a while. And I stood there in the dark for a minute before I turned the light on. And when the light came on, I looked at the canvas that was still on the easel from the last time I'd been in, 7 months prior. An unfinished piece, blues mostly. A lot of that deep blue I'm drawn to.
What did you do?
I mixed some paint and I finished it. I stood there until 11:30 at night and I finished the painting. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I thought I was just going back to something familiar. But I understand now that what I was doing was practicing being only in myself, practicing the inward attention, practicing what it would mean to take up space that was entirely mine. It was one of the first acts of that in that year. Standing in a small room with paint on my hands and a canvas I'd left unfinished for 7 months and finally letting myself finish it.
Are you painting regularly now?
Most mornings, yes. An hour or two before Henry's up or while he's doing his own thing. It's the quiet before the day. It's mine. I've started working on a series of large pieces, actually the largest work I've ever attempted. Deep blues and that burnt orange colour relationships I've been thinking about for years. I don't have a show planned. I'm not building toward anything. I'm just doing it. It turns out that is allowed. You're just allowed to do something because it's yours and it feeds something in you that nothing else reaches. I am 58 years old and I am learning this now and I wish I had learnt it at 30, but here we are.
It turns out that is allowed.
It turns out, yes.
Diane, I want to ask you about something that happens to some of the people who come through this experience, and I want to know if it happened to you. There's often a moment, it doesn't always come, but when it does, it tends to arrive quietly when you look at the person you've been in pain about and you see them differently, not as the source of the disruption, not as the person who broke something, just as a person, fully, with the same weight and complexity that you give yourself. Did that happen for you with Soo-Jin?
It happened gradually and then all at once.
Tell me about the gradually first.
The gradually was the Wednesday calls. It was the slow accumulation of small details, the colours giving her trouble at work, the walk through the neighbourhood, the coffee shop on Clark Street seen from the sidewalk. Every detail she gave me, I filed not as information about her situation, but as information about her, Soo-Jin, as a person, not Soo-Jin as a situation I was managing. And over months, the Soo-Jin in my mind became fuller, more specific, more real in a way that the version I had understood her as for 30 years had perhaps not been, because that version was always partially filtered through what I thought she was supposed to be.
And then the All at Once?
Her second gallery show, the one she'd stalled on, the one that had been building for a year before she stopped going to the studio. She finished it. She finished it and mounted it at a gallery in Wicker Park, the same gallery actually, where she'd shown before, they'd kept the relationship, they believed in the work. It opened in March, about 11 months after the call, and she asked me to come to the opening, and I went with Henry. And I walked into that gallery, and the work was unlike anything she had done before.
How so?
Larger, much larger. The canvases she had worked on before were maybe 30 inches, 40 inches. These were floor to ceiling, great fields of colour, very raw, very direct, not the careful, considered compositions of the earlier work. These were, I want to say, honest, but that implies the earlier work was dishonest, which isn't right. These were unguarded. There was something in them that had been let out. She had let something out onto these canvases that she had been keeping somewhere for a very long time. And I walked slowly through the gallery looking at each one, and I felt that thing again, the thing I'd felt at the wedding, standing among her work but different. At the wedding, I thought she has figured out who she is. At this gallery, I thought she is figuring out who she is. Present tense, actively, right now. On these canvases, in this room, at 30 years old, finally arriving at herself.
That shift from past tense to present tense, that's a profound thing.
At the wedding, I thought the arrival had already happened. At the gallery, I understood the arrival was still in progress, that it had always been in progress, that the version of her I had been so certain of, settled, composed, arrived, was the version that had been locked. And these enormous unguarded canvases, this gallery full of something let out, this was the beginning of the real one. And I stood in front of the largest piece, deep blue, that particular blue she's always used, but opened up with these sweeps of a colour I had not seen in her work before, something between gold and amber, very warm against all that blue. And I thought, there she is, that's her. Not the composed one, not the managed one, that on that canvas. That is my daughter.
What did you feel?
Pride. The same pride as the wedding, but different in quality. At the wedding, the pride was the pride of watching someone arrive at a destination. At the gallery, it was the pride of watching someone realise they are free to keep moving, that there is no destination, that the arrival is a myth, that you get to keep going, keep making, keep finding out. And I stood there in front of that blue and that amber, and I thought she was so tired. Henry's sentence. She was so tired for so long. And she is not tired now.
Did you talk to her that night at the opening?
We stood in front of that large piece together for a while, just the two of us. Henry had found someone he knew and was talking in the corner. And I was looking at the painting, and she was standing next to me, and I said, "Tell me about this one." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I started it the week after I told you, after our phone call." And I said, "Oh." And she said, "I needed somewhere to put everything I hadn't been able to put anywhere." And I said, "I think you found somewhere." And she put her arm through mine, and we stood there. And that was the moment, the all at once. The moment I looked at my daughter, not the situation, not the disruption, not the incomplete story I had been carrying, and I just saw her, a painter, a person who had been carrying something enormous for 30 years and had now finally found a canvas large enough to hold it. A woman, my daughter.
I want to ask about forgiveness, because I think there's a version of this story where someone hears it and says, she forgave her daughter and now everything is fine. I don't think that's what you're describing. I think what you're describing is something more complicated and more honest than forgiveness. But I want to ask you directly, do you use that word for yourself? Is forgiveness part of what you're working through?
I have thought about this a great deal, and I think the honest answer is forgiveness requires an offence. And I don't experience what Soo-Jin did as an offence. Exactly. I experience it as a person doing the only thing a person could do when they are carrying something they have no language for in a world and a family that hadn't yet made the language available. She wasn't hiding from me out of malice. She was hiding from herself. And by the time hiding from herself was no longer possible, the hiding from me had been going on so long, it had its own momentum. That is not an offence. That is a person in survival. I can be wounded by it, and I remain wounded by specific parts of it, while also understanding that forgiveness is not the right frame. Forgiveness is for when someone chose to harm you. She was not choosing. She was drowning.
So if not forgiveness, what is the frame?
Acceptance, maybe, or understanding. The understanding that two things were true simultaneously. She was withholding something I deserved to know, and she was doing the only thing she knew how to do. Both. Not one excusing the other, both held at the same time without either one winning.
That is much harder than forgiveness.
Forgiveness has a ceremony to it. You extend it, the other person receives it, there is a before and an after. What I am describing has no ceremony. It is just the daily practice of choosing to hold both truths without collapsing one of them for the sake of neatness. It is something I do every morning, some mornings more easily than others, but I do it.
I want to note that what you're describing, the capacity to hold two truths that are in tension without resolving the tension in either direction, has a name in psychology. It's called dialectical thinking. The ability to resist the pull toward either or and remain in both, and it is genuinely one of the more difficult cognitive and emotional skills there is. And I'm struck by the fact that you've built it not from a framework or a theory, but from necessity, from love. Because you needed to be able to see your daughter clearly, and seeing her clearly required holding both things.
I did not know the term. I just knew that if I collapsed one side of it, if I went all the way to she was wrong and she hurt me, I would lose her. And if I went all the way to she did nothing wrong, everything is fine, I would lose myself. And losing either of those was not acceptable to me. So I stayed in the middle, which is not comfortable, but it is honest.
Is there anything she said to you in these months that reframed something important for you? A specific sentence, a specific moment?
She said something on a Wednesday call, maybe 4 months after the gallery show. We were talking about the marriage, about Kevin, about what those years had been like for her inside them. And she said, and I want to get this right, she said, "Mum, I was so afraid you would love me less. Not lose love for me, just love me less. Like the number would go down." And I said, "The number doesn't go down." And she said, "I know that now." And I said, "Did you believe it then?" And she was quiet. And then she said, "I didn't have enough information yet."
I didn't have enough information yet.
I have turned that sentence over many times. She didn't have enough information about me, about what I was capable of, about whether the love I said I had was the kind that could hold this particular weight. She didn't know, because I had never shown her, not because I didn't have it, I had it, but because I had never been tested in that specific way, she had no evidence that I would pass the test. She was operating on uncertainty, and so she did what people do when they are uncertain about whether they'll be held. She held the thing herself for 30 years.
And what does that understanding ask of you going forward?
It asked me to be more transparent, not just with Soo-Jin, with everyone, to say the thing, to ask the real question, to be the person who makes the specific kind of space she never had, so that if someone in my life is carrying something they believe is too large for the room, they have evidence that the room is larger than they thought. I cannot go back and make that space for Soo-Jin in the years she needed it. I can make it now, and I can make it for Ellen. And I can make it for Henry, who also has things he holds quietly and turns over internally and only presents when they're finished. I can make the space. It is the only thing I have left to do with what I learned.
That is a remarkable way to understand the use of pain, not to transcend it, to use it. I want to ask about where things are now, you and Soo-Jin today. What does that relationship look like? What does a Sunday look like?
She comes to dinner most Sundays. Not everyone she has her life. She has her own Sundays now, which is right. But most. She comes alone sometimes. Sometimes she brings, there is someone, I'm not going to say much because it's very new and it's hers, not mine. But there is someone. And she brought her once to a Sunday dinner in January. Henry made the coffee correctly, and I made the doenjang jjigae, and we sat at the kitchen table, all four of us, and it was ordinary, in the most extraordinary way. It was just a Sunday, food, conversation, the comfortable quiet that this family has always been good at. And this woman, she was thoughtful and a little shy and very clearly attentive to Soo-Jin in a way that made Soo-Jin seem held. And I watched them at the table and I felt something I could not have predicted a year ago.
What did you feel?
Gratitude. Not the kind you perform because you're supposed to. The real kind. The kind that sits low in your chest and stays. The same place the pride lives. I looked at my daughter across that kitchen table in the particular light a winter Sunday has in Chicago. And I thought, there is someone at this table who makes the number feel like it goes up, not down. And I thought, she has found the right room, finally. She is in the right room.
What about Kevin? Where are things with Kevin now?
The divorce finalised 7 months ago. Kevin is, from what I understand, from what Margaret tells me, and from the very brief contact he and I still have, Kevin is doing the work of rebuilding. He bought an apartment in Andersonville. He is seeing a therapist. Margaret says he runs every morning now, which she seems to find meaningful in a way. I understand you need something physical to do with the extra energy of grief. He and Soo-Jin have been in contact, not often and not without difficulty, but in contact. They were married for 4 years. They were together for 6. That does not evaporate. They will be finding the shape of what's left for a long time. I hope it is something good. I believe it will be, because they are both fundamentally people who try to do right by the people they love. That doesn't stop just because the love changes form.
And Soo-Jin's painting?
She is working on a new series. I know this because she showed me some studies on a Wednesday call, held her phone up to the camera and walked me through the sketches. Big pieces again. She is building toward a solo show, her first solo show, which feels important. The gallery in Wicker Park wants it. She's aiming for the fall. I have already told her I will be there at every single hour the doors are open. She told me I was being excessive. I told her I had 30 years of gallery attendance to make up for. She laughed. Soo-Jin laughing, a real laugh, an unguarded one, is one of the more recent entries on the list of things I am grateful for that I did not used to have.
Tell me the thing you are most grateful for, given all of it. The thing you know now from the other side of this that you could not have known before.
I know who my daughter is. That is the thing. I know who she actually is. Not the edited version, not the version that was narrow enough to fit in the space she thought she had. I know her, and she knows I know her, and she allows herself to be known. And the price of that knowing was enormous. A marriage, years of pain for both of them, the particular grief of a future I had imagined that turned out not to be real, enormous. I would not minimize it. I would not make it smaller than it is. But what I have on the other side of it, what I get to have for however many years we have left, is a real daughter. Not a performance of one. Her. The actual her.
And is that enough?
It is more than enough. It is everything.
Diane, there is a pattern interrupt I need to name, because you said something earlier that I've been sitting with this entire conversation, and I think it's the thing I most want to close on before we go to our audience. You said you're 58 years old, and you're learning that you're allowed to do things that are just yours. The painting, the sitting still, the cup of tea that stays warm. And I want to say this back to you, because I think it's as important as anything else you've said tonight. What happened to your family opened something in you, not only a wound, also a window. And the woman sitting in the kitchen making paint at 6 in the morning before Henry's up, she was in there all along, waiting for a room large enough to be in.
You know, I never thought of it that way. I thought of this year as the year things broke. But you're right that something also opened. I couldn't have seen it a year ago. I can see it now. Something opened.
Something opened.
Something opened.
Pauline Boss, who developed the concept, describes it as loss without closure. Loss that doesn't have a clear endpoint, a burial, a ceremony, a moment when grief is officially permitted to begin. What you experienced is a particular variant of that. You didn't lose Soo-Jin. She's at your table on Sundays. She sends you phone photos of her sketches. She tells you that you're never an interruption, but you did lose something. You lost the version of her you had been holding for 30 years. And that version, while incomplete, was built from real love and real attention and real years of being her mother. The fact that it was incomplete doesn't make the loss of it small. And the fact that you lost it at the same time you were being asked to celebrate her freedom creates a grief that has no obvious place to land. There's no one to be angry at. There's nothing to mourn publicly. The thing you lost was a picture, and pictures don't have funerals. That ambiguity is real, and it deserves to be named. The second thing I want to name is what Diane described when she talked about the space she never made. In family systems therapy, this is sometimes called implicit family communication, the rules a family operates by that were never spoken aloud. Nobody in Diane's household ever said, "We don't talk about sexuality." There was no decree. But the absence of certain conversations over years and decades communicates its own message. This is not a room where those words live. Children are extraordinary readers of those implicit rules. They don't need to be told something is forbidden. They feel the shape of the room and they understand, without being told, what fits inside it and what doesn't. Soo-Jin was reading that room from childhood. And what she read, not hostility, not cruelty, just the ordinary silence of a family that had never had occasion to speak on this, she read as, "This is not safe." And she was not entirely wrong, because she had no evidence yet that it was. The lesson Diane drew from this, that transparency is something she now practices actively as a daily discipline, is not just a personal healing. It is the kind of structural change in a family's communication that can reach forward into the next generation. It matters beyond just the two of them. The third thing I want to name is Kevin, because this program is about straight spouses, and in this particular story, the straight spouse is 32 years old, and his name is Kevin, and he is still, as far as we know, putting himself back together in an apartment in Andersonville and running every morning. And he made a phone call. He made a phone call to his mother-in-law at an hour when most people would not have found the capacity. And he said, "I think you deserve to know before it arrives any other way." That call was an act of extraordinary decency, and it is worth saying that the straight spouse in any story is not only the person who tells us the story. Sometimes the straight spouse is the person in the background, rebuilding quietly, being decent in private, finding a way to remain a person who tries to do right. Kevin is part of the story, even though he's not here tonight. And I hope, wherever he is, that the running is helping. The fourth thing, and the one I want to leave you with, because I think it answers the question narrator asked at the beginning of tonight's episode, is this: does the discovery unmake the love? Diane answered that question tonight without using those words. She answered it at the wedding when she said the day was real. She answered it in the kitchen when she said she was drowning, and that is not an offense. She answered it in the gallery when she said, there she is. And she answered it at the Sunday dinner in January when she felt gratitude, the real kind, low in the chest, watching someone make the number feel like it goes up. The discovery does not unmake the love. What it does, what it asks of the love is more. It asks the love to expand to include the truth of the person it was always meant for. It asks the love to be large enough for a canvas that is floor to ceiling, unguarded, and entirely honest. And the love either is or it isn't. Diane's was. Turns out it was exactly that large. She just needed to find out. Diane Park, Chicago. The kitchen at sunrise. The tea that finally stayed warm. The painting that is nobody's but hers. Diane, I want to sit with your story for one more moment before we hear from the people watching tonight. Because there are a few things in what you've shared that I think deserve naming with some care, and I want to do that now, honestly, because I think you've been honest enough with us tonight to deserve honesty back. The first thing I want to name is something psychologists call ambiguous loss. A lot of people have been sitting with your story tonight, Diane. I know that from the messages that have been coming in while we've been talking. I want to read some of them because this community is one of the things I believe most in, and the things people say in these comments, I want to share some of them with you.
I'd like that very much.
Sarah Beth from Chattanooga, Tennessee shares this. I am 3 years out from a similar call, not a son-in-law, but a daughter-in-law calling to tell me about my son. I remember the grocery list detail specifically. Mine was a permission slip I was signing for my younger child's field trip, the mundane objects we are holding when the world shifts. What I want to say to Diane is the winter does end. Not all the way, there will always be some cold in it. But the particular cold of not knowing, the cold of waiting without understanding what you're waiting for, that cold does end. You are further than you think you are. The grocery list, the permission slip, the ordinary things that become monuments to the moment they were interrupted. In the hundreds of responses we've received for tonight's episode, there's one from Pastor William Tanner in Macon, Georgia, that I've read several times. He writes, I come to this from a place of faith that not everyone here shares. And I want to be honest about that. I believe marriage is a covenant. I believe the covenant was broken, even though I understand the breaking was not malicious. But I also believe God does not waste pain. And what I see in Diane's story is a woman who took enormous pain and turned it into an expansion of love rather than a contraction of it. I do not know how to reconcile all the theology of this. But I know love that expands rather than contracts is closer to God than love that protects itself. I'm still working through what that means for everything else I believe, but I am still working through what that means for everything else I believe. But that sentence will stay with me. Now, I want to share something from a username, just the username, no location given. And this one I want to read exactly because it asks something that deserves to be in the room. At Unmapped Shore writes, there is something in the way this story is told that makes accountability feel very optional. Kevin lost years. He is rebuilding in an apartment he didn't choose. Soo-Jin made choices, yes, from fear, yes, from survival, but they had real consequences for a real person who had no information to protect himself with. I find myself wanting the story to sit longer with what he lost and whether the language of she was drowning functions as a way to bypass that reckoning. I'm not saying forgiveness is wrong. I'm saying maybe Kevin gets to be angry for longer than this story makes space for. That is a question this story cannot fully answer tonight. What I will say is that Kevin's grief is real and his reckoning is his own, and no narrative about Soo-Jin's survival, however true, erases what the gap in information cost him. Both things are true, both things are heavy. This program tries to hold both. From Portland, Oregon, username May Solano writes, I was Soo-Jin once, graphic designer actually, which made me catch my breath when I heard. I did not come out until I was 33, and by then I had been married for 5 years to the most decent man I have ever known. The thing people don't understand is that the hiding is not about the other person. It is not a commentary on their love or their safety. It is about a self that has been so thoroughly taught to disappear that it no longer knows how to appear. I painted too in those years. I stopped painting. The stopping is always the first sign. Not that anything is wrong, that something is being held down that needs to rise. I am looking at Soo-Jin's gallery show in my mind, and I am crying, and I am grateful for every enormous unguarded canvas. A self that has been so thoroughly taught to disappear that it no longer knows how to appear. That line belongs to May from Portland, and I think it will outlast this episode considerably. And if what May just described lives in you or someone you love, if any of this has opened something that you've been carrying quietly, please drop a comment below. This is a community that will receive it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, not because we're asking you to, but because the next person who needs to hear that they are not alone needs to find this channel when they go looking. Help them find it. From Naperville, Illinois, not far from where Diane lives, actually, Patricia Oze writes, I have been a friend in the middle. The kind of friend who knows something and is watching two people not know it about each other and cannot say anything because the saying belongs to someone else. I watched a marriage in my community dissolve in a very similar way, and I watched the mother sit in the grief of not knowing, and I did not tell her because it was not mine to tell. And I have never been sure I made the right choice. This episode gave me language for something I have been carrying without language for a long time. Thank you is not big enough, but thank you, Patricia, for watching. For being the kind of friend who respected the right of someone else's story to arrive on its own terms. That is harder than it sounds. From Denver, Colorado, Nathaniel Aguirre writes, "My honest reaction to this episode is complicated. I understand Diane's journey and I admire it. But I want to say something about the institution of marriage and what it costs when it is entered into. Without full information on both sides, I am not assigning blame. I understand that the closet is a prison and the people inside it are not there by choice. But Kevin did not have a choice either. And the systemic failure here, the world that built the closet Soo-Jin was locked in that failure, has real victims who did not build it. I think we need to talk about what society owes the Kevin Marshes of the world, not just what individuals owe each other. What society owes the Kevin Marshes of the world? That is a conversation this program will keep returning to. Nathaniel from Denver, that is a question that does not have a simple answer, but it is one I respect you for putting in the room. And finally, from someone who describes herself only as 23 years old, writing from her college apartment in Columbus, Ohio, a username, I am the generation after all of this. I grew up with language that my parents didn't have, an openness that my grandparents couldn't imagine, and I still sometimes feel the weight of what was inherited, the silence that got built into families before anyone knew, to dismantle it. What Diane's story tells me is that it's not too late to dismantle it. That a 58-year-old woman can learn that something is allowed, that a mother and a daughter can find each other across 30 years of accumulated quiet. If they can do it, maybe we can build the rooms a little earlier. Maybe the next generation doesn't have to sit in the kitchen until sunrise figuring out whether to call. Maybe we can make that call easier to make before the crisis demands it. Celeste from Columbus. 23 years old and already thinking about the rooms she wants to build. I want to close with her because I think she is right. The work Diane did, the work Kevin did, the work Soo-Jin is still doing in a studio in Chicago on canvases that are floor to ceiling, and finally honest that work belongs to the generation after it too. It is the work of making the room large enough. And it starts every time with someone deciding to sit in the kitchen until sunrise rather than walk away from the question. Diane Park, thank you for sitting in your kitchen. Thank you for staying until the light came. Thank you for calling your daughter. Thank you for refilling her bowl. Thank you for going back to the studio and turning the light on and finishing the painting. Thank you for coming here tonight and trusting us with the whole of it. This community is better for having heard you.
Thank you for the space to say it. I think saying it out loud is part of how it becomes something you can live with rather than something that just lives inside you. I needed to say it out loud. Thank you for listening.
If this episode found you somewhere real tonight, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't, share it with someone who needs to find it, and come back. Next week, we hear from someone who sat in a different kind of kitchen, in a different kind of city, with a different phone call and a different silence and a different kind of love that had to find a larger room. We are not done with these stories. We are just beginning. This is The Straight Spouse. I'm Harvey. Good night.